That famous painting, Death of Nelson, by Benjamin West, with William Jr. being dragged off the deck on the bottom corner. Altogether, 720 boys fought in that battle, and they served at every single level of the ship's society. Think about it now.
Matthew Sheldon is head archivist at Portsmouth's Royal Naval Museum.
Matthew, you've actually got William Rivers' diary.
Yeah, it's quite unusual to actually have a kind of personal account from this date from someone who was young. He went to sea actually at the age of, I think, 6½, and he then actually stays on the ship on Victory for the next 10 years, right up to the Battle of Trafalgar.
He was exceptional, but probably not unique.
I'm sure he wasn't unique, no, and we've got another case on the people who were on board at Trafalgar with a father and a son on board, so that did happen. So certainly not an exception, but I think 6½ is quite young. Yeah.
Yes. Well, what are the other materials here?
This is a prize money register. When ships were in action, if they captured a ship, the value of the ship was divided amongst the ship's crew. Here we see it being shared out after the Battle of Trafalgar, and I particularly like this one for Samuel Robbins here, who is getting his £1.17 6. And so there you have a kind of 15-year-old Marine Society boy. Did he get educated?
Well, he can certainly sign.
Absolutely. Did he get educated by the society, or actually did he get some learning on board?
Marine Society boys were the naval equivalent of the parish apprentices. They were boys who were dependent on the state for their welfare, and who, instead of being sent to cotton mills, found themselves in naval barracks and trained for the sea. Not all of these raw recruits were orphans, however. Many were just kids who found themselves in a spot of bother.
The Marine Society were concerned about the growing number of teenagers they saw hanging around on the streets, seemingly unsupervised, and a bit like the sort of the USPO kids we have today, that are so like something must be done. And then the solution was like, why not send them to the sea? They seem to be quite lively. That would be the kind of boys initially, but also generally just people struggling to care for their children.
So sometimes parents would bring their children to them.
Sometimes parents, friends, sometimes masters who would be dissatisfied with their apprentices would come up and say, look, he's incapable of learning the trade, he wants to go to sea, can you take him?
Well, Roland, what was it like for these boys when they found themselves on board ship?
It was obviously a tough change. They lost their home, they lost any attachment figure they would have had before, and were thrown into this community of sailors, not exactly choir boys, being 13 or 14 years old only, so it was surely very intimidating at first.
But we heard horrible cases in battle of boys being injured and people being killed around them.
They all remember their first encounter with death. That seems something that sticks with them forever. The first time they see someone's head blown away by a cannon shot, that sticks. But then what is remarkable, from then on, they all say that that they're numbed to the horrors of war.
We had not fired 2 broadsides before an unlucky shot cut a poor man's head right off. The horrid sight, I must confess, did not help raise my spirits. The ship that struck us was so much disabled that she could not live upon the water, but gave a dreadful reel. We were afraid to send any boats to help, because they would have been sunk by too many souls getting in her at once. You could plainly perceive the poor wretches climbing over to windward and crying most dreadfully. Even our own men were in tears, groaning, God bless them.
But were they really numb to it?
We've got testimonies that sailors are apparently having 7 times more likelihood of ending up in a lunatic asylum. So really the signs are that they very much struggled afterwards, that while they were on board it was all fine and covered up, but when back on land and alone, then the truth maybe came out, and it really showed like if they'd ever digested it, or if they'd locked it up in like a sea chest deep down in their soul and hoped never to open it again.
Obviously, these hellish experiences left their mark. But the testimonies demonstrate that the harshness shown to the children of the Revolution did not stop them from acting selflessly towards others.
Take the older brother of the young Alexander Somerville, the wonderful William.
William was a stripling when I was born and worked for such wages as a youth could obtain in that part of the country. When he came home at night, he would strip off his coat, take off his hat, put on his nightcap and get down the Elsham box and sort through the awls, hemp and scraps of leather. He'd examine all the children's feet to see which of them had shoes most in need of mending. And then he would sit down and cobble the shoes by the light of the fire until near midnight. He would rise at 4 o'clock in the mornings and do the heaviest part of James's work amongst the farmers' cows and other cattle before going to do his own day's work 2 or 3 miles distant. James was too young for the heavy task of cleaning, so William got up every morning to do that part of his work and so keep James in employment.
The one overriding motivation for these children was helping the warm heart that was at the centre of their lives, their mothers.
My brother and I had the deep satisfaction of knowing it was not through any fault of our mothers that we were forced to go through so much privation. For she was our good angel in the home and the one on whom we all had to lean.
Mother, Mother, I've earned half a sovereign and all of it myself, and it's yours, all yours, every bit is yours.
In time, my wages went up to 9 shillings a week, and I was able to be a real help to our little household and lighten somewhat the burden of care resting on my mother's shoulders.
Boys and their mothers, eh? But mums became the centres of their world because more often than not, dads were away or missing. Their absence was prompted by poverty, death, travelling for work, and in the case of 10% of the male population, because of being called away to fight abroad in the Napoleonic Wars.
Feckless fathers were often blamed for exploiting their children by the politicians and the upper classes. But in many ways, men were the first victims of industrialisation. Machines took away their skills and livelihoods and called upon their children who were cheaper and more docile. Those fathers were left behind.
It was when I was about 8 years old that our family misfortune fell to our lowest ebb. The saddling trade in London had been going worse and men were short of work. The large army contracts for cavalry saddles had now all gone to the factories. It was the beginning of 1876 when my father was turned off from his work and became unemployed. The effect of these undeserved fortunes on my father was however noticeable to me then and later. After 1876, he became more and more silent and even morose. There is no greater trial to a self-respecting and good workman than that of finding his services are not needed, leaving him to spend his days trying to secure a job only to be met by the sign, "No hands wanted." Add to this the misery and poverty when he returns home, and it is not surprising that even a strong-minded man should break down.
Given the frequency of broken families, the grinding poverty and the need to work, these children could never have enjoyed a childhood as we might know it. But there again, this was an era where the concept of childhood remained fluid. People were at odds about what childhood meant, when it started and when it finished. Even the children were sometimes confused.
In 1850, the journalist Henry Mayhew interviewed a nameless 8-year-old watercress seller in London's East End.
On and off, I've been very near 12 months in the streets. Before that, I had to take care of a baby for my aunt. No, it wasn't heavy, only 2 months old. But I minded it for ever such a time, until it could walk. Before I had the baby, I used to help my mother, who was in the fur trade, and if there were slits in the fur, I'd sew them up. All my money I earned, I puts in a club and draws it out to buy clothes with. It's better than spending it on sweet stuff for them that's got a living to earn. I ain't a child, and I shan't be a woman till I'm 20, but I'm past 8, I am.
A lot of children, when they started work full-time, and of course the watercress girl had been at full-time work since about the age of 5, ceased to think of themselves as children. And sometimes they felt much better about themselves when they did start working.
So what motivated them?
I think that just comes automatically. And you're not earning, of course, for yourself. You're earning to tip up the earnings to your mother, who might give you a little bit back. But it's basically for the family. And if you can think, as I think of some people do, you know, my money went towards the joint on Sunday, the only meat we get in the week, then you're going to feel a sense of self-esteem and pride.
By the middle of the 19th century, there seems to have been a groundswell of concern that as a society we were not allowing kids to be just children.
As early as the 1830s, people are talking about these children being children without childhood. Now, I think the origin of this, the most immediate origin, is the Romantic poets, and it's difficult actually to exaggerate the impact which Wordsworth had. Wordsworth got away entirely from the idea of original sin. He thought children came from heaven, trailing clouds of glory, famously. So they can actually rescue adults who've gone astray. Now, if you begin to internalize this kind of view of childhood, then the lives of these children at work are anathema. People begin to say, when a child starts work, he or she ceases to be a child. And that is
certainly
completely
that innocence
different.
would be lost.
And certainly the innocence would be lost because they'd be mixing with adults who... but they would be having their childhoods taken away from them.
The only way they would have their childhoods handed back to them would be if Parliament intervened. And that was something that initially seemed highly unlikely.
It's not surprising that the first official reports into child labour were supportive and written in a stomach-churning, rose-tinted way.
I have visited many factories, and I never saw a single instance of corporal chastisement inflicted on a child. Nor indeed did I ever see children in ill humour. They seem to be always cheerful and alert, and the work of these lively little elves seemed to resemble sport. As to exhaustion of their day's work, they evinced no trace of it, emerging from the mill in the evening to commence their little amusements with the same alacrity as boys issuing from school.
So why did things change? Why did this place, the Houses of Parliament, start to legislate against child labour? When did Britain begin to think that working kids to death was a bad idea?
Parliament had largely been happy to keep its nose out of the issue of child employment. Crucially, though, the times were changing. The children who'd survived the mines and factories were growing up and getting organised into early trade unions. Popular culture also began to report on the worst abuses. Dickens started his serialisations of Oliver Twist and Nicholas Nickleby, and he knew a bit about child labour. At 12, he'd worked 12-hour shifts in a blacking factory with a boy called Fagin. Slowly, reform began to manoeuvre itself onto the political agenda. In 1831, radical MP John Hobhouse tried to introduce a bill restricting child labour. He proposed that no child under 9 should work in a factory, and that 9 to 18-year-olds' hours of work should be limited to 12 a day or 66 a week. Radical.